So, recall what we said up to this point. There are three parts to the soul: the spirit, appetite, and reason. Virtue of reason is wisdom. This is being able to discern what will happen given various kinds of actions, and being able to figure out which actions, which results are desirable or valuable. Okay? There's temperance. This is a virtue of the appetite. Temperance allows us to, is an appetite functioning well, neither desiring too little nor desiring too much. With spirit, we have the spirit, the virtue of spirit is courage, and this is not being a berserker, not just going after everything non-stop, and as not being just completely slovenly or cowardly, not just sitting off in the corner. Well, the last virtue is justice. Now, unlike the other virtues, justice doesn't have just one part of the soul that it deals with. Instead, justice deals with the entire soul, all parts working together. Now, a rough idea behind justice is, giving to each part what's due. And in this case, again, I think the gardens are a nice example of this. Right? There's a justice, a balance in the Japanese gardens. There's definitely the appetite, the motivation. There's definitely the appetite here, right? Where we still have natural things, and they still contribute to the beauty of the gardens. It's not completely structured or rigid, where everything's just wiped away. There's definitely reason. This is where there's definitely a wisdom here, where reason dictates what kinds of forms to give to the trees, and what would happen with certain prunings and how to guide the trees. There's still courage here. Is the motivation to produce a beautiful garden like this to begin with. I mean, it takes a lot of work to do something like this. If there was no courage at all, if there's just complete laziness, then this garden would never be produced. And if it was, somebody went overkill on this, pruning it all the time, we still wouldn't have the gardens. It takes courage to figure out. It takes wisdom to figure out when to hold back. But this is justice. This is the cooperation for all the parts of the soul. So here in the gardens, you can see how the cooperation with all the, as an analogy, you can see how the parts of the soul cooperate and are regulated to produce this beauty. It's really amazing. So that's justice. Justice is giving to each part what is due, letting each part do its job, and make sure that no part dominates the rest. Plato's conception of morality, I think, is pretty different from what we talk about today. I'm pretty sure most times today we use morality as a reason to hate each other. That's not necessarily involved in Plato's view. Instead, morality is about, being what you're supposed to be. Being or living in such a way that fulfills your function and brings you happiness. So really, the most moral person is the one that's most happy. And the one who's least moral is not necessarily a vicious, evil villain in the movie. Usually under Plato's view, the most immoral person is the one who's most miserable, probably even delusional. I think so. One of the reasons why people are evil is because they just don't know what they're doing. He's following Socrates on this matter. So morality is going to be about a proper functioning of the soul, about reason, appetite, spirit, all working together so that a person can be the happiest person that they can be. Let's contrast this to the sophist notion, or one of the sophist notion, the one that's at least makes sense, or can be a contender for a moral theory. It's the idea that what's moral is what brings pleasure. Now, Plato isn't going to completely disregard pleasure. Of course not. Pleasure is going to be a function of appetite. There's going to be some pleasure that's good. Right now I'm sitting out here. I'm certainly working in a sense, and I'm enjoying making these philosophy videos. But look at what I'm enjoying: beautiful plants and gardens, lovely weather. Right now, a breeze is just blowing through here, and that's very nice and cool. I find that pleasurable. So pleasure isn't completely disregarded. And, in contrast to what you might think with this emphasis on reason and contemplation, it's not as if, reason can go unchecked either. Right? Somebody who devotes their time entirely to memorizing facts and ignores the appetites of the body probably is not going to be a very happy person. Right? That person will experience minimal, if any, pleasure. And that doesn't really help either. Spirit has to be balanced as well. You have to know your limits. You have to know what you can do, right, before you try to do everything. This is, I think, one of the things that we struggle with a great deal in our society. We keep increasing the number of hours to work per week. When I was, a kid, 40 hours a week was considered putting in a full week. Now we put in like 50, 60 hours a week because we're trying to impress the boss. Plato would think that's a little crazy. We have no time for pleasure, no time for knowledge. These things are important for the soul too. And as a matter of fact, our society tends to be less happy than what we used to be. Maybe there aren't enough people going out to gardens and reading books in a library. So, pleasure is not completely cast aside, and we need every part of the soul in order to be a happy person. That doesn't mean pleasure is the only thing. The goal, the proper function of a human being is going to be balanced between the three parts of the soul. To say that pleasure is the end-all, be-all, it's, to put the soul out of balance. And this happens quite a lot. It's really easy, in fact. I'm really sure more than a few of you are familiar with the idea of partying on a Friday night simply for the pleasure and regretting it Saturday morning. If there weren't any bad side effects the next morning, maybe that would be fine. And every once in a while, as long as you keep it within virtues, it's not a bad thing to go out and have fun with friends. No, of course not. But it's a bad thing to overdo it. To think that pleasure is the only thing that matters means that there's no way you can over pleasure, right? There's no way to do an excess of pleasure. That's probably false. Yeah. So, pleasure is one consideration, but it's not the only consideration. And in this, Plato thinks, and Socrates too, Plato thinks that the sophists have got it wrong. So, just to conclude, just to wrap things up, so morality is a function of happiness. It is determined by what makes a person happy. To figure out what makes a person happy, you got to know what a person is. What a person is has three parts of the soul: reason, appetite, and spirit. Reason has the virtue of wisdom, knowledge, and knowing the right goals. And the right goals are the ones that produce happiness. Appetite has to do with bodily pleasures and needs. And these things aren't completely discounted. Spirit has to do with motivation, drive. You can overdo spirit, you can have a deficit of spirit. And the proper balance between all three of these is justice. Justice. It is possible for Plato to be unjust to oneself. Morality is a tricky issue. What we don't have here is necessarily a nice treatise on everything that makes a person happy, or is there only one thing that makes people happy? It's an interesting question. Earlier I used the Japanese tea gardens as an example of justice, how the parts of reason, appetite, and spirit came together to produce that garden, by analogy. Well, that garden's really lovely too. But it doesn't look like a Japanese tea garden. There's very clearly more than one way to have a beautiful garden. If we're going to draw the analogy over, does that mean that there's more than one way to be happy? And even if there's variation of ways to be happy, is there something that, all these variations that they ultimately point to one kind of happiness? So to use the example of the Japanese tea gardens in this garden, right? The Japanese tea gardens, that Japanese tea garden and this garden are both aiming at beauty. And sure, there's variations of beauty. There's different ways to be beautiful. But they're both aiming at beauty. The same thing happened with a person. Is there one thing that makes us happy, and then how we live out our life are just variations of that? Or is there just a wide variety of things that make people happy, that are dissimilar, that they don't unify, they don't point to one thing? It's an interesting question. We'll talk about it in class.